Hey guys, so now we're going to deal with a topic that I consider to be really, really important. And I've said this for some other sections, but perhaps I haven't meant it as much in any other section as in this one. So I think it's really worthwhile to pay attention to the points I'm going to discuss and, eventually try and apply them to your own games. So what we're going to be discussing is passivity. And what does passivity in this context mean? Well, it simply means falling into a very passive position, and we're going to try and understand what leads you into possibly falling into such passive positions. We're going to do so by taking a look at a bunch of games and focusing on some of the key elements that lead to a passive position, or put a different way, getting into the habit of asking ourselves certain questions that might reveal to you whether, there is a possibility for falling into a passive position. So, first of all, to explain very clearly, a passive position in chess, well, since chess is a game of your army versus the opposing army, then therefore, as we know, there's a lot of creation of threats and taking the initiative and improving the position of your pieces, or to continue the analogy, sort of mobilizing your army and then optimizing how well placed everything is. And there are all these elements. But when you fall into a passive position, it's when you find yourself not really able to make much progress in terms of improving your position and maybe creating threats against the opponent, but instead you sort of have to sit back and allow your opponent to build up the pressure against you while you just sort of sit without really being able to take action against him. Instead, you're simply reacting against his or her plans. So that's more or less passivity as it applies to chess in a nutshell. The final thing that I want to say before we actually get onto the games is that, just to try and make life a little easier for you guys, I've come up with a quick and very much unofficial acronym, which is a four-letter acronym, SWAP, SWAP. And what the acronym stands for are four elements that influence greatly the activity or the passivity of one's position. And so it's good to get into the habit of asking yourself a question on each of these four. And, well, depending on what answer you get, you'll get a quick feel for whether or not your position is at risk of becoming a passive position. So the first one, the letter S, stands for space. In general, the side that has less space is the one more at risk of landing into a passive position. We're going to take a look at that. The W stands for weaknesses. If you have more weaknesses than your opponent, you're more likely to end up in a passive position, because what can happen is your opponent will attack your weaknesses and you will sort of have to defend them with your pieces. And if you have too many weaknesses, your pieces may all get tied down to the defense of these weaknesses. So that's a very big one too. The A stands for how actively placed are your pieces in whatever the starting position that we're examining may be. The more actively placed your pieces are, the less likely it is that you're going to fall into a passive position. Finally, the fourth one, the P, stands for planning. How easy is it for you to plan in whatever position you may have, right? It doesn't have to be a long-term plan, but can you figure even a 3 or 4 or 5 move plan that helps you to improve your position or disimprove your opponent's position in some way? If you're really struggling to find a plan, then you may very well fall into a passive position, especially if you don't have a plan, but your opponent does have a plan to improve his position. Tied somewhat, not fully, but somewhat to planning is the idea of pawn breaks. So you could also think of that within the letter P. Some authors have gone so far as to say, no pawn break, no plan. I'm not 100% in agreement with this, but I want to throw it out there because it's important to understand that there is a very deep connection between having the possibility of a pawn break and having a plan. So we're going to hopefully touch upon that one a little bit as well, although it won't be the focus. So anyway, that is more than enough for introductions. We will now take a look at a series of games and we will encounter swap. So space, weaknesses, activity of pieces, and planning / pawn breaks. We will encounter all of these throughout the games that we will examine. So I hope you enjoy. So the first game, we're just going to go in chronological order. The first game is a game between Rubenstein and Schlechter, all the way back in 1918, two well-known masters of the past. And here Rubenstein outplays Schlechter. We're going to breeze past the first few moves. In this position, so far, d takes c4. Everything is okay. Nowadays, actually, they play this move a4 just to prevent any sort of b5 ideas of defending the pawn. Rubenstein continued with e3, and here black should indeed take the opportunity to defend the pawn, and then play continues with a4, b4, knight b1, or sometimes knight a2, and okay, the game would have taken a totally different trajectory. However, what happened was that Schlechter played the following move, bishop to g4. This move I don't really like, because after bishop takes c4, well, black has released the tension in the center only to then allow white to recapture the pawn without any effort. This is usually not a very good idea because now white has these two pawns in the center and black only has one. Now we know that central control and space typically go hand in hand. And so here already we see the first letter of the acronym, space, starting to work to white's advantage. The game continued with the move e6, castle, knight bd7, h3, and here Schlechter makes the decision to take the knight on f3. Now after queen takes f3, we see that white now has the bishop pair, and in what may become an open game, that bishop pair is going to translate into essentially better, maybe not quite piece activity, but better piece power. The pieces that he will have, the two bishops and a knight, are going to be able to create more threats than the two knights and a bishop on this kind of a board. So already that's two advantages for white, and black doesn't really have too much to show for in return. Black continued with bishop e7, white now goes rook d1, castle, e4, and after rook e8, white now goes bishop to f4. So we really see that Schlechter has misplayed the opening and given too much to white. Look at the extremely actively placed pieces. Notice on the other hand, especially this knight here on d7, and in fact the knight on f6 as well, they're really lacking squares. The knight on e5 can only go perhaps to b6, but even there, if it goes to b6, white will maybe drop the bishop back to b3, and from b6 it's not doing too much. Similarly, we can see that the knight on f6, well, it doesn't have too many options either. So therefore, we can now see that black lacks space and certainly lacks piece activity. Well, what are the other questions? Weaknesses, the W, and the possibility of a plan. Well, remember what we said about planning. We said that it often goes hand in hand with pawn breaks. We noticed that white has the possibility to advance on d5 at some point. Maybe e5. Maybe advance on the queen side, though that one seems less likely. Perhaps even advance on the king side with moves like g4, g5, or h4 as well. On the other hand, for black, the most likely pawn breaks are moves like c5 and e5. But to open up the d file right now would be very, very scary prospect. And even to open it up a move or two from now would still be scary, because the more that the position opens up, the more that that's going to favor the bishop pair. So we see that really black is struggling for a good plan here. As a result, he actually just plays a little bit of a waiting move, knight to f8. There's not too much purpose to this move. And in fact, it immediately allows the breakthrough, d5. Rubenstein immediately punishing Schlechter, and after pawn takes pawn, we see that black doesn't have too many options. If he, for instance, advances the pawn, then white can advance his pawn, and this bishop is trapped. Once again, notice the effect of a lack of space. It also wouldn't be especially good to capture the pawn, after which even knight takes d5, we see that all of the white pieces are really coming into play. And remember, when we speak about weaknesses, well, after some position like knight takes, and now even bishop takes d5, we see that there's a weakness here on b7. There's also an x-ray on the queen, and even this point here on f7 is a little bit loose, because it's attacked once and defended only once. And additionally, for those of you more astute observers, the queen is x-raying the point on f7, so there are even more possibilities for tactical shots. Instead, black actually played the move queen to b6, but this allowed the pawn to advance to d6. Now black had to drop the bishop back to d8. So once again, if we speak of space, we can see that this pawn is really cramping black's position. Notice the impact it's had on this bishop. If we speak of weaknesses, there aren't too many weaknesses right now for either side. If we speak of piece activity, well, certainly the bishop here on d8 is very inactive, and it's also disrupting the communication between these two rooks. And for now, the knight on f8 as well, it's not really in the game. We've already said that the knight on f6 doesn't have too many jumps. We said that earlier. And yeah, that still applies. So overall, the piece activity for black is not very good. Whereas white has this really strong bishop, has a queen that is exerting influence on the king side. The bishop on f4 is also an important piece. It's defending this strong passed pawn. And even the knight on c3 is controlling important squares and may jump in the future. White here, in my view, should have played the move rook to e1. This actually is a very principled approach. We notice that white is not concerned about losing this pawn, simply because black's position is too passive and vulnerable to be able to afford grabbing material. Let's see what would have happened. And now, clever move, rook e to b1. The queen is actually really struggling for squares. For instance, if the queen goes to c2, can you see what will happen? In fact, the move would be bishop to d3. Queen takes knight on c3. Well, the queen is being x-rayed, and we can see bishop takes h7 check will collect the queen. So therefore, after rook e to b1, queen a3 would be needed. Now rook takes b7, knight e6, and after a move like simple move like rook d1, well, both sides have lost their b pawn, but the loss of the b pawn for black is more serious because, among other things, it has resulted in a weakness here on c6. Additional points are that the queen on a3 may find herself misplaced, and also that the rook that captured the pawn on b7 is now an extremely active piece. So we see that piece activity once again coming into play. So let's take a step back. We had said that, in my view, rook e1 would have been the best way to continue. And here, the principle of play is that if we look at this position right here, well, this rook is on the only open file of the position. So it's a very active piece. Now, after white's move rook e1, white prepares to challenge one of black's best pieces. And so the principle there is that, if your opponent has, say, 2 or 3 passive pieces, like this rook here on a8 and the bishop on d8, if you just go about swapping off, exchanging his more active pieces, then sooner or later, you're going to leave him with just bad pieces, right? That's kind of the crux of that strategy. And it's a very commonly used strategy by the side that has the more active position. Instead, Rubenstein went a different route, which is a reasonable one. He played the move pawn to g4. Grabbing some more space, remember the S in the acronym swap, and also what we had mentioned earlier, he is threatening to open up the line of attack from the white queen through to the f7 point once he plays a move like g5 and kicks out this knight on f6. Notice as well how after a move like g5, any potential jumps for the knight would be jumps to light squares. But remember that white is the only one with a light squared bishop, and this is really hurting black's possibilities. Okay, so black instead went knight to e6, and now white pushed the pawn to d7. Black now went rook to e7, he didn't have too many options, and now white plays bishop d6. This is once again typical of when you have a passive position, you are constantly reacting. Notice, after g4, black reacts to g4 by playing the move knight to e6, so that this diagonal is a little bit better covered. Then after d7, black once again has to react to white's play, rook e7. After bishop d6, once again black has no choice but to react and capture the pawn on d7. White has sacrificed the pawn here, but the point is seen very soon. He captures the knight on e6, f takes e6, and now plays the move pawn to g5. And the white dominance has actually culminated in the win of material. The game is essentially over because black cannot move the knight from f6. If he moves anywhere at all, then white will play queen f8 with checkmate. So therefore, this is, I think, a very, very instructive example of black falling into a passive position and then playing a series of moves that were simply reacting and reacting to his opponent's threats, but eventually the threats became too strong, the pressure was too much, and there was a loss of material, and with it the game. This is a very, very common trajectory when you have a passive position against a very strong opponent like Rubenstein. Just to go back very quickly, how did he fall into that passive position in the first place? Well, after d takes c4, which is okay, e3, he makes the mistake of playing bishop g4, which doesn't fit in well with capturing the pawn on the earlier move. Here, white captures the pawn and immediately has that central advantage. A few moves later, black here in this position gives up the bishop pair, and immediately white's pieces will be both more active and more effective in this kind of a board. A few moves after this, we see that white completes his development with the move bishop to f4, and now all of his pieces are much better. He has more space. He has better central control. And black is left without any real plan, while white has several promising continuations available to him. Black plays a move like knight f8, which is an indication of not really knowing what to do, struggling to improve the position, and a very typical way of converting this kind of a position where your opponent is passive is to look for the most effective breakthrough at the right moment. Rubenstein wasted little time finding it. He plays the move d5, cracking open the position along the light squares. Notice that. d5 will break open the position on the light squares. Very important when you are the one with this light squared bishop here on c4 and your opponent does not have one. After this, it's basically just reaction, reaction, and reaction from black. And by the time that sequence of action and reaction has finished, black may as well resign. Notice here, well, d5 contains many threats, so he has to capture. Pawn takes. Now the threat by white is to either push or capture, so black flees with the queen. Now white advances. Black has no choice but to drop back. White advances again. Black felt like he needed to close this diagonal. This was, I think, a mistake nevertheless. Now white advances again, threatens the rook. Black does not want to go rook f8 because after bishop d6 the exchange will be lost. So he goes rook e7, but nevertheless bishop d6, the rook is attacked, take the pawn, bishop takes knight, take the bishop. As we can see all of black's moves are forced, and after g5, as we saw earlier, the knight is lost. Game over. So, okay, the game actually dragged on another 14 moves before Schlechter resigned, but this position is losing, so we'll stop our analysis here. Let's take a look at the next game.